Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. In our last session, we took a question from one of our Kalyanamitta around the Byasana Sutta and why only 2 of the misfortunes lead to rebirth in lower realms. In this session, we're going to look at the story of Tissa Thera. This is from Dhammapada verse number 240, and his attachment to his robe and how he ended up reborn as a louse in the animal realm and was potentially going to be reborn again into hell, but ended up being reborn into the Tissa Thera realm when the Buddha stepped in. So we're going to use it like a case study, just to go over what we were looking at before and maybe take it a little further as well. I'll just read out what's in the extended commentary to this Dhammapada verse. So it says, while residing at the Jetavana monastery, the Buddha spoke this verse with reference to Venerable Tissa. The story goes that a certain youth of respectable family who lived at Savatthi, retired from the world, became a monk and made his full profession, becoming known as Venerable Tissa. Subsequently, while he was in residence at a monastery in the country, he received a coarse cloth 8 cubits in length. Having completed residence, he celebrated the terminal festival, and taking his cloth with him, went home and placed it in the hands of his sister. His sister thought, "This robe cloth is not suited to my brother." So with a sharp knife she cut it into strips, pounded them in a mortar, whipped and beat and cleaned the shoddy, and spinning fine yarn had it woven into a robe cloth. The Venerable procured thread and needles, and assembling some young monks and novices who were skilled makers of robes, went to his sister and said, "Give me that cloth, I will have a robe made out of it." She took down a robe cloth 9 cubits in length and placed it in the hands of her youngest brother. He took it, spread it out, and said, "My robe cloth was a coarse one, 8 cubits long, but this is a fine one, 9 cubits long. This is not mine, it is yours. I don't want it. Give me the same one I gave you." And then his sister said, "Venerable, this cloth is yours, take it." He refused to do so. Then his sister told him everything she had done, and gave him the cloth again, saying, "Venerable, this one is yours, take it." Finally he took it, went to the monastery, and set the robe makers to work. His sister prepared rice gruel, boiled rice, and other provisions for the robe makers, and on the day when the robe was finished, gave them an extra allowance. Venerable Tissa looked at the robe and took a liking to it. He said, "Tomorrow I will wear this robe as an upper garment." So he folded it and laid it on the bamboo rack. During the night, unable to digest the food he had eaten, he died and was reborn as a louse in that very robe. When the monks had performed the funeral rites over his body, they said, "Since there was no one to attend him in his sickness, this robe belongs to the congregation of monks. Let us divide it among us." Thereupon, that louse screamed, "These monks are plundering my property," and thus screaming he ran this way and that. The Buddha, even as he sat in the perfume chamber, heard that sound by divine ear or supernormal hearing, and said to Venerable Ananda, "Ananda, tell them to lay aside Tissa's robe for 7 days." The Venerable caused this to be done. At the end of 7 days, that louse died and was reborn in the abode of the Tissa Thera. On the 8th day, the Buddha issued the following order: "Let the monks now divide Tissa's robe and take their several portions." The monks did so, and amongst themselves discussed as to why the Buddha had caused Tissa's robes to be put aside for 7 days. When the Buddha was told of their discussion, he said, "Monks, Tissa was reborn as a louse in his own robe. When you set about to divide the robe among you, he screamed, 'They are plundering my property.' Had you taken his robe, he would have cherished a grudge against you, and because of this hostility would have been reborn in hell. That is the reason why I directed that the robe should be laid aside, but now he has been reborn in the abode of the Tissa Thera, and for this reason I have permitted you to take the robe and divide it among you." And the Buddha continued, "Craving or attachment is indeed a grievous matter among living beings here in the world. Rust arises from iron. Arising there, it eats or destroys itself. Thus, for one who transgresses proper use of the requisites, it is their own volitional actions that lead to a bad destination. So this is a very detailed version or commentary behind this particular Dhammapada verse. And so we're going to use this story to analyze how Venerable Tissa ended up in the animal realm as a louse, and also how he could have ended up in hell because of his strong attachment to his robe. Let's refresh our minds about the Byasana Sutta, and in particular where the Buddha says, it is because of misfortune regarding virtuous behavior, sila Byasana, and misfortune regarding view, ditti Byasana, that with the breakup of the body after death, beings are reborn in the plane of misery, in a bad destination in the lower realm, in hell. So we're going to look at specifically how Venerable Tissa ended up in the lower realms. And we will see that it's regarding virtuous behavior or his lack of virtue, and misfortune regarding view, so his loss of right view and holding on to wrong view, that he had this bad result when he passed away. One of the suttas that we've looked at before is the Hāliddikāni Sutta, and this is in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, discourse number 3. We had a whole session on this one, and it was one of the full moon Poya sessions, and it was called Why It's Difficult to Renunciate the World. So we're going to reference this a number of times to help us to understand Venerable Tissa's predicament. So there's a section in there right at the beginning. Venerable Mahakaccana, when he explains this verse of the Buddha, says, "And how, householder, does one roam about homeless?" And in Pali this is anokasari. And he says, the desire, lust, delight and craving, the attachment and clinging, the mental standpoints, adherences and underlying tendencies regarding the form element, feeling element, perception element, volitional formations element, consciousness element, these have been abandoned by the Tathagata, cut off at the root, made like a palm stump, obliterated so that they are no more subject to future arising. Therefore the Tathagata is called one who roams about homeless. It is in such a way that one roams about homeless. So we've said before that we are not considered homeless, whether you're monastic or a lay person, if you still have desire, lust, delight, craving, attachment and clinging, the mental standpoints, adherences and underlying tendencies. If we still allow ourselves to activate paticca samuppada, the process of dependent origination, and if we keep making a home, allowing consciousness to establish in form, feeling, perception and volitional formations. This is very much what this is talking about. And so when you look at this story about Venerable Tissa, you can see that his attachment to his robe is very strong. We can use this table of the 4 unprofitable directions to explain Venerable Tissa's predicament. So if we go to the first column of the first unprofitable direction and look at the physical nutriment, kapalinkara ahara in Pali, this is Venerable Tissa's robe. He had the perversion, if you go down the column, the robe is attractive and not unattractive. So Venerable Tissa received some robe cloth and his sister altered that robe cloth, and then it was made into a robe for Venerable Tissa, and then he became quite happy with that robe. What happens at the level of this perversion is really what we understand as abhinandati, abhiwadati, ajosayatitati. That is how craving comes to arise. He took delight in that final product being his new robe, and he welcomed it or expressed it by saying, "Oh, this is very nice." And then he remained holding. The remaining holding is that he expected to wear that robe tomorrow. And so you can see the terms that Venerable Mahakaccana was explaining about chanda. This has arisen for him, the desire for the robe. He had an intention towards it. Lust, if you go down that escalation of the desire for it, you come to the dart of lust, ragasala. And of course, he has already taken delight. There's been that craving. And of course, the attachment and clinging is there because he's made the plan. And so when you think about the mental standpoints, adherences, and underlying tendencies, what you really see is that he is losing his right view. He expects that that robe will still be there tomorrow. If he didn't think that, he would have remembered, oh, maybe he might pass away, or maybe there would be a fire where the robe gets destroyed, or maybe a thief comes to steal it. some kind of idea like that, but instead he's added permanency to his subha object, his attractive or pleasing object. And when he does that, he obtains the pleasure from that, the sukha. So when there is that sukha, which you could clearly see from the story, that he has this new wonderful robe, then he has taken it as mine. And so when he has taken it as mine, what happens is he's made that plan. So you could hear him, tomorrow I'll wear that robe. And in his mind, particularly as the story goes along, you can see he has taken it as mine, and it's very strong. The attavadu upadana, that clinging to the theory of me and mine, is already there. And so when he says it out, thinking that is my robe, and I'm going to wear it tomorrow, then the adherence is there, and he is now clinging to views. So he's already looping around that before he goes to bed. He's actually holding on to wrong view. The other aspect to this is, when you look at this first unprofitable direction, what is clearly happening, particularly with the physical nutriment, is form is the steadying point for consciousness establishing. When he is still holding to this physical nutriment, consciousness is saying, how can I experience this again? So at the point of death, what has potentially happened to him is that this strong desire for his robe is activating this desire to come back and experience the robe. And the only way that can happen is this process of wanting to be reborn, to be with the robe. Now, when you say it like that, you think, oh, how can that happen? But in this story of Venerable Tissa, it has happened. And so the escalation of sensual desire becoming lust, having the craving, having the wrong view, therefore at the point of death, it is very, very strong because he went to bed with that particular abhinandati abhivatati ajosaya thittati. So he's still holding on to it, clinging to it. Therefore, he wants to come to exist again. So he's reborn as a louse in the animal realm. And even as the louse, what's very strong in the story that comes across is that he was still holding on to the cloth. So that's rather alarming. What is also apparent about Venerable Tissa is that he wasn't a stream enterer. Because if he was a stream enterer, he would have been safeguarded from the lower realms. And so clearly he had not had that door bar of ignorance removed. And therefore this whole thing unfolded in this way. If he had have been a stream enterer, then he wouldn't have had this predicament. The view, particularly around me and mine, would have been removed, and therefore it wouldn't have been possible for him to go to lower realms. We can also see another part to the process that is explained by Venerable Mahakaccana in the Hāliddikāni Sutta, and this is around roaming about in an abode. So Venerable Mahakaccana says, and how, householder, does one roam about in an abode? By diffusion and confinement in the abode, consisting in the sign of forms, the sign of sounds, the sign of odors, the sign of tastes, the sign of tactile objects, the sign of mental phenomena. One is called one who roams about in an abode. So the Pali phrase for diffusion and confinement in the abode is niketta visara vinibandha. So this process is an interesting one because it helps us to understand the process of what happens when we start taking in, having attachment, craving towards the physical nutriment. So the diffusion, the visara that happens, is an external process, and the vinibandha or confinement is an internal process. So when we talk about diffusion, in the case of Venerable Tissa, it's around the robe cloth and it eventually becomes the robe. So initially it's this coarse robe cloth that is transformed by his sister, and then with the help of other helpers and monastics is turned into a fine robe. And so that's the diffusion process as it goes from potentially something that is quite ordinary to something that becomes quite attractive for him in the external sense. So the vinibandha process is the internal one. So where he starts to take it as subha, so attractive and something that he quite likes, and that process that transforms with permanency to expecting pleasure from wearing the robe, having the robe as mine. And so you see that that's how this diffusion and confinement process works. He becomes someone who roams about in an abode. The reason why we reference Hāliddikāni Sutta in order to explain Venerable Tissa's predicament is really because we want to see how he has taken delight in the world and therefore is bound to future arising, and not just any future arising, but arising in the lower realms. So the verse that the Buddha has uttered, that Venerable Mahakaccana is explaining in the Hāliddikāni Sutta, is Okang Pahaya Aniketasari, having left home to roam without abode. Game Akupang Muni Santavani. In the village the sage is intimate with none. Kamehi Rito Apurakarano, rid of sensual pleasures without expectations. Katang na Vigeya Janena Kayirati. He would not engage people in dispute. So you can really see, particularly the last 3 lines, what is happening with Venerable Tissa. He has been intimate in the village by going to the festival and then having dealings with his sister, and persistent dealings with his sister, particularly over the robe cloth. And you can see how Venerable Tissa is not rid of sensual pleasures. Although he's a monk, it is sensual pleasure in how he has taken the robe cloth. What is happening is this process of lust, desire, affection, thirst, passion, and craving that comes with sensual pleasures. And that hasn't left him, even having been reborn as a louse. In fact, it's very strong. The appropriation is starting to really take hold. And then you definitely see that he's entertaining expectations. For him to say before he goes to sleep, the evening before he passes away, I will wear that robe tomorrow. There is a plan there. And then when it comes to engaging people in dispute, we don't see that when he is in his human form as Venerable Tissa, but we see this happening when he is reborn as the louse and he's still taking the robe as mine. In the commentary where it says the louse is screaming, these monks are plundering my property, and he's very, very upset about it. And the Buddha says he is about to hold a grudge against the monks who are going to divide the robe into different pieces and share it amongst the Sangha. You can see the hostility that is emerging from that and the very strong mental misconduct at that point, because we know that hostility, upanaha, or even having the ill will and anger towards the Sangha of monks would be something that is not very good mental actions. And this is having taken that robe as mine. And so the Buddha literally saves Venerable Tissa from the hell realms, because he gets to be with his robe for 7 days before he passes away. What the Buddha is pointing to is really further loss of virtue. If Venerable Tissa as the louse were to strengthen the covetousness and anger, ill will, hostility, if that keeps escalating, then he has very severe loss of virtue. And so he would have been reborn in the hells. So that's a very interesting insight that we get from this particular Dhammapada verse and commentary. So the danger is very apparent. Intimacy in the village, not being rid of sensual pleasures, entertaining expectations, engaging people in dispute. This whole process strengthens one's bonds to the world. And if you don't loosen the grip of this process by taking solitude, by seeing the dangers in sensual pleasures, by contemplating impermanency, rather than having very strong plans and expectations, also really looking at one's attachments and clinging. It could be clinging to people, roles, and material objects. And of course, not strengthening these things by engaging people in disputes. And so when you start to clean that up, purify, particularly mental misconduct, then you have a lesser chance of having verbal misconduct and therefore physical misconduct. If we now reference the Khattiya Sutta, this is Anguttara Nikaya chapter 6, discourse number 52. This is always a very important one for us to look at because it helps us to understand what we are standing on, what is our determination, and also what is our inclination or the adherence or glue that we speak of. So when it comes to householders, we've said before that our determination is based on our skill, what we have studied, what we have trained in. Therefore, we're always inclined towards work, our job, our business. And that also entails our roles. So if one is a mother, father, leader, those sorts of things. Now, when it comes to a samana, what is said about the determination or the mental standpoint is virtuous conduct or virtuous behavior, the sila. And the inclination or adherence is nothingness. So not to be inclined or being stuck to anything. When it comes to Venerable Tissa, you can see that as a result of losing his right view and holding on to wrong view, taking the robe as mine very strongly, as we can see from the commentary, then he's lost his virtuous conduct and is looping around that really. That lack of virtue loops with the wrong view over and over. So that's what he's standing on. And Venerable Tissa is not inclined towards nothing or nothingness. Instead, he is inclined towards the robe, being the monk in the village. And potentially that entails lava sakara silokam, so the gain, honor and praise. And so he's lost sight of the final goal of Nibbana. That's what you can clearly see. And given that he's not a stream enterer, you can see why he does not have that safety from the lower realms. If we can take on board the example of Venerable Tissa as a case study for our greatest misfortune being holding on to wrong views and lacking virtue, how that can lead to rebirth in lower realms if we have not got the safety of stream entry, then it also helps us to understand how the process works. What is it that we do by taking delight in the world that leads us to these bad destinations? Not only that, it's to see with this example how one can roam about in an abode, activating Paticca Samuppada by allowing consciousness to establish in these places. What we said before was that the Buddha and the Noble Arahants are no longer subject to dependent origination, no longer establishing consciousness in that way. And they don't get duped by any of the sense objects in order to activate Paticca Samuppada. And they have known the importance of solitude, not getting intimate in the village, not keeping company that is harmful company, and therefore also seeing the danger in sensual pleasures and knowing how to train, and seeing the risk in engaging in expectations, and of course not getting into dispute. There's something very powerful in looking at this particular case study that helps us to solidify some of the Dhamma that we have been learning, but also to emphasize certain areas where we may be weak in our spiritual practice, where we're still not convinced by the words of the Buddha, by the words of the Noble Arahants, about how we must train. It is very apparent that intimacy in the village is not seen as dangerous. Sensual pleasures are not seen as dangerous. That engaging in expectations is not being retrained because it's not seen as dangerous. And getting into dispute is also something that is not seen as dangerous. All these four things are very important to the practice. The Hāliddikāni Sutta is very helpful in this respect. Venerable Mahakaccana elaborates and explains it in such a way that is so very helpful. And you can see what happens to Venerable Tissa as a very good example for why it is dangerous in this respect. Some of the things that we are highly conditioned to do that are very worldly, we think are okay. But when it comes to not having the safety of stream entry, then the risk is there. This particular misfortune can come to fruition. And so there are a number of things that are also very helpful. So the Samādhi-bhāvanā Sutta that we've learned before, abhinandati, abhiwadati, ajosayatitati, taking delight, welcoming or expressing, and remaining holding, which leads to more delight, and clinging, which leads to existence, which leads to birth. When you know that, and it applies to form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, you know that the practice that one needs to do is nabhinandati, nabhiwadati, najosayatitati. Not to take delight, not to welcome or express, and not to remain holding. Not to remain holding means not making plans. And naturally people will say, but we need to make plans. How are we supposed to go about our life? And that may be so, but you can see with Venerable Tissa, when he engaged in expectations with his robe for simply the next day, there is a risk. And if we're really honest, some of us, depending on our spiritual practice, hold very strongly to plans. If it doesn't happen, we go immediately into ill will. If something doesn't go to plan, then we go strongly into ill will, anger, and then sadness. Many people live very, very busy lives. And unless you start to disentangle yourself from that, then this predicament can be very, very real. And so it's an encouragement to really look at these various aspects that we've been through in this particular case study, whether it is about activating paticca samuppada, dependent origination, or whether it is about how we take all the different sense objects and diffuse and confine around it, or whether it's around this process of intimacy in the village, not being rid of sensual pleasures, engaging in expectations, and then getting into disputes. This final part is what you see most often in the world. And so that's why it's very difficult to renunciate the world. We are standing on so many different things, and we are inclining towards so much that is in the world. If you have a strong determination and adhitthana towards the truth, towards nibbana, then only at that point you can see the value of these meditations that the Buddha has taught us. Training in those meditations and ensuring that you are correcting bit by bit, chipping away at this. If we don't do so, then it's quite a grim outcome. We will realize our greatest misfortune, and that is rebirth into lower realms. So we must make the most of this human existence, being able to cognize this Dhamma, being able to practice it, being able to do acts of generosity in order to support that, being able to keep our virtue, all these different things, being able to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So this is an encouragement towards seeing the truth, seeing what the Buddha is pointing to and helping us to train in. Let's end with this inspired utterance from the Buddha, and it's from the Loka Sutta. This is Udana chapter 3, discourse number 10. This was 7 days after the Buddha had enlightened and he had been meditating, and upon coming out of his meditation he said these words: "This world born of torment, afflicted with contact, a disease to speak according to me and mine, or self. For whatever it conceives, thereupon it becomes otherwise. Though it is going to be otherwise, the world clings to existence. Afflicted with existence, taking delight in existence, what it takes delight, that it fears. What it fears, that is suffering. Indeed, to give up existence, this spiritual life has been lived. For ascetics and Brahmins who say through existence one is freed from existence, all of them are not freed from existence, I say. For ascetics and Brahmins who say through non-existence one escapes from existence, all of them have not escaped from existence, I say. For this suffering originates dependent on all attachment. With the ending of all clinging, there is no origin of suffering. See this world mired in great ignorance. Beings who delight in beings are not released. For whatever existence, everywhere, all over, all existence are impermanent, suffering and subject to change." We can end our session here. Let's share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Peruan Saranai.